Steph, is it always defined on a prepubescent level, or is it sometimes just a number of years difference between the offender and somebody that's under
My understanding is
consent?
that it's under 13. It's under the age of 13.
Okay.
That's whatever.
Yeah, it's under the age of 13. Aging is 10, that's statutory, it's a little bit, that's a different ballgame.
Yeah. So I guess puberty could be questionable in the process, right, as we know that there is a range there. And I guess the things I've heard, far from being very knowledgeable, is that, pedophiles, declared pedophiles, have some of their own preferences, and not all are prepubescent. That some do have preferences where someone's moving into stages of puberty. So I don't know how accurate that is or isn't by technical definitions.
Yeah, just
What do they do, like in state of New Hampshire, for instance, the age of consent is 16, so what happens if you were 14 or 15? What would be classified as then? Would you still be considered a pedophile?
so if you were 14 years old and you
14 or 15?
and you had sex with who?
Well, with
Another 14-year-old?
Oh, no, somebody who is, who would be, if you were considered a pedophile, somebody who was older that has intercourse with prepubescent, then is that classified in New Hampshire as 14 or 15-year-olds too? Or is it
Well, most states do it by like 12 or 13, right around 12 or 13, and there's a lot of variation in state laws. Right? But I think it would be in New Hampshire, I think it's 12. Yeah. So it would be 12 or younger.
But pedophile's not a legal category, so
No, it's
psychiatric.
a psychiatric
Right,
category.
DSM, right? Well,
Yeah.
but I guess, wouldn't states have the right, not too much time, wouldn't states have the right to still decide how much they want to lean on that? Because it is, it's in the National Diagnostic Manual.
Right.
That's why I'm recalling something from that,
No,
in the nomenclature, I'm recalling something about a 5-year differential factor between the parties or something.
Stephanie, what did they call,
I'm not sure about that, Scott. Not being a psychiatrist.
I don't know.
what is the terminology for having sex with a child between, say, 13 and 18? Is there, if it's a pedophile under 12 or 13, what do they call this attraction to prepubescent children? Is there a name?
For pubescent?
Well, a child who's in puberty, who's not yet a consenting adult.
Generally, those types of crimes aren't necessarily as compulsive as someone who has that attraction to younger children. I think those offenders tend to be more situational offenders, right? Where they find themselves, they're attracted to adults, but they find themselves in a situation where they end up having sex with somebody underage. And that's usually who that group is. It tends to be more the teenagers, like that 13 to 17 age.
Another question. You said that sex offenders with boys is at 35%. Do you have any sense of what it is for the same offenses with little girls? Is it much different?
I don't have a sense of what that is. Although I think girls it's higher in the teen group. I think it tends to be higher. I don't know for molestation for boys. I mean for girls, what's the percentage for recidivism. But I know that it tends to be more the situational offenders. So you get somebody who finds themselves in a situation where they have sex with more of a teenage, and then they somehow get caught by the law, if that makes sense. Right? Where I think the pedophiles tend to fall more in the preferential offenders, right? And that's kind of the preferential situation. That's a typology that's been done by criminologists, and the FBI actually use that today to profile cases. Is that somewhere answered? Sorry, I don't find that though. So, a couple of other assumptions though that we talked about from some of these cases, right? One of them was that sex offenders actually murdered their victims, right? This actually tends not to be true. But a lot of people think that sex offenders do really murder their victims. As you see in some of these really celebrated cases, right? All of these children ended up murdered, right? Really horrific. But most sex offenders don't. It's actually really rare. Only about 1% of all sex crime victims get murdered. Right? So that tends to be a myth as well. Another assumption that we have from some of these cases is that offenders are strangers, right? That there are these strangers who are actually lurking around playgrounds, around parks, around shopping malls, and around schools, right? And that our kids are most at risk in these areas. And I rather remember as a school-aged child being told to watch out for the people driving in the white van, the guy in the white van giving out candy. Like, I remember that, growing up in the 80s. So I can feel like I can really kind of understand that, this myth, this enduring myth. And I, like many others, believe this commonly held misperception that strangers are the ones to fear, right? And that strangers are more likely to be sex offenders. But most research today actually shows that sex offenders are usually either acquaintances or family members, right? So research that's been done on research estimating the relationship between the victim and the offender for sex crime shows that between 14 and 30% of sex crime victims were assaulted by strangers. So a small amount. And I will say I think that differs a lot by whether the victim is a child or an adult, right? Because sometimes those adult rapes are strangers. So I think for children it's actually on the lower end. For adult rape, I think that might be a little bit higher. But acquaintances are the most common, and family members I think would come second, following in that. And most victims are actually sexually assaulted in their own home, so about 40%. And then about 20% are either in a home of a relative or a home of a friend. So I think if we just continue to say that we're afraid of strangers, right, and strangers are the issue, then we don't really have to face the fact that might not be the area that we need to focus the most on, right, which seems to be more the families and closer relationships. Another one is that these sexual assault victims are all children. Right? And some scholars actually argue that adults, and some crime data actually do show that adults are the victims of sex crimes more than children. But you got to remember that there's more adults in the population in the United States than there are children, right? Just because of the number of years that we have. So I think children are a really vulnerable population, and they are disproportionately likely to be victimized compared to adults. But in sheer numbers and frequency, adults are the victims of sex crimes more than kids, right? So I think that issue is a little bit more complex than that was clear cut. But the last assumption that I wanted to talk a little bit about is this belief that sex offenders aren't able to be rehabilitated, right? And that the treatment options do not work, as evidenced by these really high offending rates. And while this is true that there's no cure for pedophilia, not all sex offenders are pedophiles, as we talked about, right? And pedophiles are those individuals with the primary sexual interest in that prepubescent children. And these typologies of sex offenders have long recognized that there's a lot of difference in the different types of sex offenders and in their motivations and their methods. One big distinction is between that preferential and situational offender that I mentioned. And just to tell you about how many people there are, about 20 to 25% of all offenders make up the preferential offenders. And about 75 to 80% of all offenders make up the situational offenders. So overwhelmingly so, the situational offenders are more common, but preferential offenders have more victims, right? Because they tend to reoffend much more. And so we can't miscategorize or assume that all sex offenders are preferential offenders, which we often do. Right? We often do.